Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this gray, rainy day. I'm Hattie Hartman, Sustainability Editor at the AJ. I'm hoping to brighten your day with a stimulating discussion about two recent small projects which are leading the way in their approach to sustainability. We're going to look at two very different projects today, one with a hard-headed and determined approach to social sustainability, and a great example of how architects can use their agency when carefully deployed to bring about lasting change in a community with a knock-on effect in other places. The second project pioneers the use of locally sourced natural and biorenewable materials in a small cottage in Somerset, an approach that we all need to be thinking more about on every project. We're very fortunate to have Darren Bray, the 2022 winner, with us today, as well as Summer Islam, designer of one of the shortlisted projects. AJ Small Projects is by now firmly established as part of the AJ's annual calendar, and I've been reviewing the projects annually for about 15 years now. We've always had a debate, as has the RIBA, I should say, about whether there should be a separate sustainability prize, because ideally, all projects would have some sustainability embedded across the board, but we know that that's not the case. So I think, and I'm a firm believer, that it's really important to shine a light on the projects that are leading the way so that others can learn from them. And that's why we're here today. The format for this discussion is that Darren and Summer will each present their projects for about 10 minutes. Then we'll have a short Q&A between the three of us, and then we'll take questions from the audience through the chat function that's at the bottom of the screen, not the Q&A function. So, because I'm only going to be looking at the chat. So put your questions there. These are both really interesting projects. So please get your questions ready. First, we're going to hear from Darren. Darren founded Studio Bad 4 years ago after more than a decade at Pad Studio and stints at Reformat Architects and Architecture PLB. Bad Studio is based in Southampton and is now 6 strong with several part-timers and collaborators. Darren has also done a lot of teaching over the years and is now teaching 2 studios at the University of Reading. Darren, tell us about St. Margaret's Church in Portsmouth, and you can share your screen when you're ready.
Thanks very much, Hattie. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to Hattie and to the Architects Journal for inviting us this afternoon. So I've titled this short presentation, Social, Economic and Environmental Sustainability, because that's pretty much what it sort of encompasses. So shortly after we formed the practice, sort of 4 years ago, somebody who I was teaching with at the time, who happened to be head of Portsmouth City Architects, Andrew Melbourne, who I've taught together for a number of years, invited us to go and have a conversation with St. Margaret's Church, which had recently been reopened after it had been condemned 2 years previously by the previous archdeacon, primarily due to the roof. So we were invited to go and have a conversation with the church to see whether we could kind of help them. So if anybody knows the South Coast, the island of Southsea in Portsmouth, this is where the site is located. The church sits on a corner of Highland Road and is opposite the cemetery. There are 2 parts to the building. The sort of front element is a 1950s extension to the existing Victorian building. And we were invited to go and have a conversation with the church after they had had a grant successfully awarded to them by the Church of England of around about £250,000. So we kind of spoke to them and said, look, we're going to work through a series of acts in the way that we work with you. And that first act was kind of engaging in community engagement. We said we wouldn't do anything until we'd had a session. So myself and Roger Tyrrell, who's my long-term mentor and teacher from Portsmouth University, ran a community engagement session just before one of their Sunday services. It's really important for us to kind of understand the people The chap here in the front is Stephen Morgan, the first ever Labour elected MP in the city. And so we had about 150 people that came to that day, where we kind of talked to everybody about what was the future of church, not just about this church, but what was the future of the church in the 21st century. So having had the building condemned sort of 2-3 years previously, it was up to us to kind of reimagine what church was as a focal point for the community. And we held this sort of day where we kind of, for us, it was about deep listening, understanding what the community wanted. And we came up with this quite clear idea that the church would become a vessel of light. So this is the kind of an example of some of the feedback that we had on the day, which we kind of sort of curated and then basically sort of worked with the main church community to kind of formulate an overarching brief. For us, it was really interesting because this little slogan was at the back of the church: "Come as you are, not perfect people allowed," and that kind of really aligned with us as a practice. And kind of we took the community engagement and then started to kind of prioritize what the main elements were for the church. So as I said, part of that concept was the idea of vessel and light, and how do you bring that back into a building, both in terms of kind of the technical aspects of a project, but also the kind of sort of community aspects of a project. So Act 2 was to look at a feasibility study, which was to kind of fundamentally what we had to achieve was an insulated and heated building. It had no heating whatsoever. But the biggest challenge was the fact that we weren't going to be able to replace component parts of this building. So it was working with Mesh Energy, who kind of worked on a detailed feasibility study to look at how we might be able to get heating back into this building. Faith was really, really important. It had to be right at the center of this project, but also for them, it was about how do you bring community back into this building. So we talked a lot about permeability and the fact that churches quite traditionally have quite a hard edge and face to them. So we spent a lot of time doing all these sketches, working through the conversation with the community and how you kind of invite people back in. How do you get that permeability back into the building? What is the kind of welcoming aesthetic of a church? So we did quite a lot of sessions with the church, just kind of working through these ideas and the kind of overarching idea was to create a street within the church that would have a number of different elements to it. So it wasn't just church as we believe on a Sunday. It was kind of bringing different elements, and some of those elements were around the idea of cafe, shop, children's play centre. Part of that project also was to kind of develop an extension to the front of that, which has been in planning for about 2 years and is still in planning with Portsmouth City Council. So for us, it was about a meanwhile use. So how could we use the budget wisely? How could we kind of look at testing incremental interventions? So the first element that we were given was a little sort of Sunday school room, and we had a very tiny budget of about £10,000 to design this screens. And this screen was really important because it was like a sort of one-to-one mock-up of how we treat the building really carefully, because it wasn't just about getting permission from the community within the church. We have to go and get permission from the Portsmouth Diocese. So we kind of looked at this element as a small piece, and then kind of developed that as an element to install within the church. So this was like a kind of our first intervention, and it was we had to be very careful, kind of a forensic respect to the building to make sure that we weren't going to change it. So this kind of birch ply screen and door was the kind of stepping back, and I've never seen so many people so excited about a door and a screen, but it gave us permission then to be much more radical with what we did next. So this is the existing space, and this is us moving on then. You can see the screen in the background, which we installed. So then it was about looking at how we brought heating and life back into this building. So We looked at kind of installing 2 air source heat pumps. It had an existing parquet floor within the church, which we took up and removed and sold, so that went back into the budget. And then our environmental guys, Mesh, looked at designing an underfloor heating system that would go throughout the sort of 450 square meters. We also looked at putting new toilets in. We designed a cafe on wheels. So the cafe on wheels is a sort of a temporary element, which will then go into the extension once we get planning permission. We then got some extra funding to put a children's play centre in. That funding came from community infrastructure levy within the city. We also designed a food bank to go in, a secondhand shop, and a bike recycling shop to go into this. And so our big radical proposal to the church and to the diocese was to pour a polished concrete floor over the top of the underfloor heating. So we did a session in London with a client where we went and visited Lazenby as the main subcontractor. We then went to the Garden Museum at Lambeth to kind of show the client exactly, what they were going to get. And then suddenly the whole space was transformed once we started to put that floor in, and it was quite a dramatic day, even on the day where the pump exploded and we ended up with concrete all over the road. We had the most amazing bunch of New Zealand guys who were laying that floor on the day from Lazenby, who were just so super chilled and amazing. And then kind of once we'd sort of poured that floor, it was about coming back to how do you re-engage with the community, because once we'd got our renewable heat source back into that building, it meant that we had heat. And once you've got heat in a building like this, it means that you can do any number of things. And we were just coming out of COVID as we were really relaunching the building, and it was at the kind of the most perfect time, really. People wanted to come out, they wanted to re-engage. So we kind of ripped out the existing front door, which was quite heavy and cumbersome and not particularly permeable. We designed a very simple timber screen and door, which then started to sort of guide vision deep into the church. And for us, there were a lot of young families that came back to the church. It's been seen as a kind of an asset now to the community, and it's used 7 days a week. There isn't just the cafe, the food bank, and the shop, and the children's play centre. There are all the groups that have kind of re-engaged, and so the church also developed a sort of business plan over that period and tested, the idea of the component parts. So they have regular income coming in now. They have free heat source. So it means that we've gone from a building that had been condemned and not really being used to a thriving community, to the point now where Fran, who was the religious leader, has just been ordained. I went to his ordination back in the summer, and he's now looking at kind of planting a new church within a separate building within Southsea and Portsmouth. So this is on a day when the shop that sits within one of the arches and the wings kind of spills out, and then you have people coming. The shop and the cafe are only open on about 3 days a week. You can see the little children's play centre, which is just kind of in 2 of the other wings of the church.
How are you doing on time, Darren?
Am I running over?
A little.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm just about to finish. So here we are. This is the cafe on wheels. We had local artist Fark, who did the artwork within. That's our little shop. There's our children's play centre. There's families enjoying the space. There's our little library and the screen that I mentioned. And I'll just leave you with this quote. Thanks very much.
Really interesting, Darren. It's such an interesting project. I'm particularly intrigued by the notion of, a modest intervention such as the doors and the screen that establish trust. So then you can come back with something, really bold, spend all the budget on the underfloor heating, which might not have gone down so well if you, just came up with that straight off at the beginning. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to save my questions for after. We're now going to hear from Summer Islam. Summer Islam is an architect at Studio Abroad, a practice she co-founded in 2014 after several years at 6A Architects, where she was an associate. She's also a co-founder of design and research consultancy Material Cultures, which promotes strategic approaches to greater use of biorenewable materials across the industry. Such an important topic. We're going to hear more about that. Summer has also done a lot of teaching over the years and is currently teaching, I believe, at the University of the Arts, right? A module called Construction in Detail.
Yeah.
So we're zooming in now. Material Cultures launched a new book last week. I was planning to go to the launch and I was waylaid by the tube strike. We're also going to hear a little bit about that. But first, Summer is going to talk to us about Blockhouse, which was shortlisted on AJ Small Projects this year, designed by Studio Abroad in collaboration with Material Cultures. So Summer, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Hattie. Thank you very much.
I hope you're putting your questions in the chat, everybody.
Give me a sec, just get this up.
I don't
Great.
see any questions yet.
What can you see? Can you see a white screen with an image?
Yes, we see the Blockhouse.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. Right, I'm going to talk a bit about Blockhouse. And so Blockhouse sits on the site of a former hermitage on an estate in Somerset. And the original building was a repurposed cricket pavilion, which was then latterly occupied by a nun. And the building was squashed by a 24-meter tall, 80-year-old beech tree. So the client's brief was to rebuild the hermitage as a new building, as a kind of private retreat with strong connections to its surroundings, built with much better quality materials and designed in sympathy with the landscape. And we were able to see what the building had originally been built with when it was completely shredded by this enormous tree coming down. It's quite a spectacle. So the new structure was enlarged to accommodate an independent bedroom and veranda, and it sits several meters north of the original building. So we, actually, maybe you can't see my cursor, but it was in the kind of white space on that drawing there.
We can
we
see
moved, right? So we moved the building from where it was, basically to bring it outside of the line, which is this kind of curved kind of bubble, which is where all the tree root balls of all the different trees which still exist on site end. So we decided not to kind of destabilize existing trees further, and we had a survey done and looked at the conditions of the ones which were left, pulled some of those out where they were also quite unwell, and moved the building north. And the building itself is prototypical insofar as we think of it as being something which could exist in other places, also that it's an experiment. And although it's a very small structure and built with quite a limited budget, it illustrates that low carbon construction built with local supply chains is not only possible, but can also create beautiful places to live. There's a living room, a bedroom and a bathroom, and a small mezzanine upstairs, the bedroom and bathroom, which houses a boiler and a small nook for storage and maybe another place to sleep. This is a kind of axiometric of the whole frame, so you can see all the different timber components in this. The deck kind of spans across both foundations, which I'll talk about in a sec. And then there's a very lightweight cassette wall system on which the roof rests, basically. And the columns to the veranda are acting more as structural ties to prevent uplift than being kind of load-bearing columns in themselves. So the timber frame is inherently low carbon, and we used as much as possible a palette of locally sourced timber. And we also worked with hempcrete and wood fibre insulation. So the hempcrete was in block form, hence Blockhouse. The embodied carbon of the structure is extremely low. It's 96 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per square metre. Or if you count sequestration, which is very controversial, then it comes down to 27 kilograms. When we finished the building, it was bright orange. This is the colour and tone of it. So that's predominantly because of the larch cladding to the low external envelope and deck, and then the cedar shingles, which were kind of brilliant copper colour. So the building continues now to be sheltered by the remaining beech trees, which are healthy and also enormous. And it sits on flint foundations. So as a consequence of the tree roots, the question of foundation design was very critical. We looked initially at screw piles, but they proved to be too expensive once we went to tender. In the end, we settled on a flint trench. So we dug these parallel trenches, they were filled with flint and then capped with an 80% GGBS cement topper, about 100 mil. And we spent a long time working on how we could make that low or no cement. And in the end, GGBS was the most economical solution. And then we went around the country trying to find the only places in the UK, which there are 2 left, that still produce steel and as a consequence produce GGBS as a byproduct. And then you can use that as a mixer in the concrete. Because I think we found in our research that most GGBS in the UK used to bring the embodied carbon of concrete down is actually now imported from India, because we don't have a very sustained steel industry anymore. And the timber was sourced from the local sawmill in the village, and the supplier and the contractor, I guess, had some reservations about our approach to material selection and general specification. And it began a quite positive dialogue with them and with all the local builders merchants around the positive benefits we saw of working with natural materials in construction. And we sourced the hempcrete blocks from HD Matthews in Buckinghamshire. Hempcrete was very unfamiliar to the main contractor, and I guess the dialogue around that was really interesting. By the end of the project, they were very proudly celebrating the building's sustainability, bringing other clients over to show them the kind of walls and what they were made of. But when we originally put the works to them in tender, they priced that package of installing the hempcrete blocks as though they were made of stone, which put the labour for that material installation up 5 times higher than it really needed to be. And it took us a kind of back and forth to have a discussion around the fact that these blocks are made of plants and you could cut them with a bandsaw. And also we didn't require a kind of a perfect masonry finish on the inside, and we were kind of happy with the kind of wet lime that we ended up with. And we had to wait, sorry.
Summer, I just wanted to say, there seems to be a problem with the chat. So please, could everyone put their questions in the Q&A instead, and I'll try to field them from there.
Okay.
Sorry,
sure.
Thanks.
No worries. We had to wait once we'd installed the hempcrete blocks for the lime to cure and for the building to dry, essentially, because we installed the hempcrete quite late in the year. And that took longer than expected, which had kind of knock-on effects on the internal joinery packages which followed. But in section, the building is very simple. We wanted to leave the blocks exposed to show them off, but we also finished them with a dusting of a clay paint, which is sprayed on to give them a kind of an even tone and bring a bit of lightness inside. Over the course of the project, we also revised the details of the external envelope multiple times, and that was predominantly driven by cost. And each time we changed the relationship between the timber frame and the insulation. In the first instance, for example, we took the step to use much smaller timber sections, which would be much more sustainable and much more cost effective. So originally we had timber, which was the depth of the full wall build. We then revised that to be smaller off-the-shelf standard stud dimensions within a full hempcrete envelope. And then ultimately that was revised again to be a mixture of hempcrete and wood fibre, which brought the cost down, but also used the hempcrete to its best effect, where the hempcrete lined the rooms internally, and so you could take advantage of its thermal mass to keep the room warm and temperature in there more consistent. We felt that the project explored for us what our values really were, whether the cost should be the primary driver before carbon, and ultimately who bears that cost in the decision around what buildings are made of. But it demonstrates for us a way forward in a kind of world where buildings are made, hopefully in a post-carbon future, in which our homes could be drawn more immediately from the landscape, more vernacular, and I guess a more traditional approach to building and architecture, which is low in embodied carbon, but also low impact on biodiversity and on the environment, and build social value in the places in which the buildings are built. And hopefully also, we think, beautiful in composition. So that's it. I've finished a bit early. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. That's great. So interesting. And I love the fact that we have 2 really different projects here. So I've got a couple of questions for each of you, and then I hope you all will put some more questions. Darren, did you go through a lot of your process to get to the fact that you had to focus on the heating? Was that fairly evident from the get-go, or how did you balance that out? There's a question that's come in the chat about any fabric thermal improvements, if that was just unaffordable, or talk us through your thinking process on that.
Yeah, because we had a very limited budget, we had to be really quite focused on where that budget went. And so we did lots of thermal modeling with mesh energy, and it quickly became apparent.
What is mesh energy exactly? What is their expertise?
So they are they're an environmental consultant, and so the church appointed them at the same. Well, we recommended that they were appointed at the same time as us.
Right.
So we were talking parallel conversations about heating really from day one.
You worked with them before?
Yes, yeah, I've worked with them probably over the last 15 years.
All right, so you knew what you were getting.
We did, and we recommended that they did some thermal modeling so that we could then have conversations with the church about where that budget was apportioned, and with the two air source heat pumps costing upwards of sort of 60-70K, we were going to really struggle to start replacing windows and looking at sort of fabric upgrades. So it was about kind of looking at where the heating was going to really benefit that space, and their recommendation was that we kind of put the underfloor heating in as a renewable heat source. So although we weren't going to physically change windows and add insulation, that's going to be done over a number of years. So at the moment we're working with the church to replace the roof and insulate that roof. So it wasn't just a meanwhile sort of solution in terms of cafe, shop, and food bank and children's play centre. It's also a meanwhile solution in terms of the thermal upgrade. What was really important was to get that heating back into the building, get people into the building, so that you then had community, you then had sort of financial funds coming into the building as a means to then move forward. So what's great now is the fact that if we'd have thrown all the budget at the building, we probably wouldn't have been able to do the underfloor heating, and therefore we wouldn't have had people in there, and people wouldn't have sort of re-engaged, and we wouldn't have money coming back into that building. So I think we've learned quite a lot in that process, and we're working on other churches where we're doing the same approach.
Well, presumably you're also conditioning the space. You don't have to condition the whole volume of the church. You're conditioning and making comfortable the first 2 meters where people are.
Well, exactly, and also horizontally as well. So there is underfloor heating under the children's play centre, but that's turned off, so that in the future, if that then gets removed and something else goes in those two arches, that can be turned back on. So it's really important to kind of zone those areas of the church.
That's really interesting. That's really really interesting. The other question I wanted to ask you, which you kind of alluded to, but I don't think you explicitly said, that the work you've done on this church, now you're looking at a couple of others, but didn't you say that the whole diocese was now reconsidering what to do with redundant churches and the role that they can play as a result of this one project?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, shortly after we did the project, and actually, interestingly, after we won the award back in February, we were talking to them about a series of other churches. So we are currently working on 2 planning applications for another church in Portsmouth and one in Gosport. We've just done a large piece of work on 3 churches on the Isle of Wight. We're working with an independent church just around the corner from here, and what's really helpful now, having done this one project where you start with your community engagement, you start with what budget you've got, and you work through a kind of meanwhile process. You're having conversations about what's the business plan. I mean, you've got to, because otherwise, okay, it sounds like a strange conversation to have with a church about a business plan, but fundamentally, if you don't talk about the business plan and you don't talk about the fundamental heating conditions, these buildings won't won't survive, because they won't have a community and they won't have people engaging with them. And I think, and it's not just churches. We're now applying this work to other sectors, and I think it's a great opportunity for architects to really sort of roll their sleeves up and use their creative problem solving skills to kind of save these buildings and save these communities at the same time.
It's really interesting. So when did this actually complete?
So it would have been probably shortly after the last lockdown. And so
Early last year.
Yeah, so we've had probably nearly 12 months of reoccupation of that building.
Yeah, so that was my next question. Are you still engaged and able to go back and see actually how this is panning out in terms of how people like it, how it's working, to the extent to which it's being used?
Yeah, so we've got a very close relationship with the church, and as I say, we're working with them to replace the roof. We're desperately trying to get the planning application approved for the extension on the front of the church. I mean, they're totally overwhelmed with the amount of people that are engaging with that church. Interestingly, it's a very young community and congregation, which again we're learning is really, really important in trying to maintain and retain these communities. Because if you get your younger members of the community within these buildings, then it means that you can kind of build all the way through in terms of your community, and it's sustaining itself now financially, which means that they can put more money into their budget to go and do the next thing and the next thing.
That's just amazing. It's a fantastic story. Okay, now over to Summer with a couple of questions. I thought it was really interesting what you explained about how the contractor completely mispriced, or, when you have unfamiliar materials, you can't take a risk, so you price it high.
Yeah.
Are there other examples of that you've run into with this project or any of your other projects?
I mean, probably all the time in little ways, but I think, there are, just often misconceptions, I think, about doing things that are non-standard or just not even unusual per se, but like not the business as usual way of doing things. I think we find that with kind of plasters, like clay plasters and lime plasters, and specifying timber from particular sawmills and particular places. I think that can, doesn't necessarily end up adding cost, but it is perceived to. So I think it's kind of always a bit of a dialogue, and the more experience we have,
choosing a local sawmill because it's local and because they're producing exactly what you think you want.
Yeah, or just trying to work with them because they are there, rather than trying to get it from Travis Perkins, who have a different kind of economy of scale behind them and different advantages and stuff like that. So so it was, it was a dialogue with the contractor, like we said, well, we really do want to use the local guys. And he's like, oh, okay, sure, but I can get it cheaper from Travis Perkins. We were like, we'll go back and have a conversation with them and see, because, just because you're assuming it's going to be the case doesn't always mean it is.
And how did that pan out?
It panned out in so far as we got the cladding timber, the decking timber, the soffit timber, and the internal joinery timber from the local sawmill, and the stud timber from the builder's merchant, who they had a trade discount with, and I think we're very good friends with.
Right.
It's also kind of
makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
It was also very interesting what you explained about kind of, as you had to rethink certain detailing in terms of the depth of the structure, you kind of rework and perfect what might work, and you bring the cost down at the same time. Were there other kind of incidences of this in that project?
I mean, it was sort of everywhere in the installation, and I think we find that over and over again in different projects, because we make a point of trying to work with natural insulations or lower carbon ones, and actually their market price has been going up and down quite a lot recently. Well, only up, not down, sadly. But since the pandemic, and then it's just kind of been slowly climbing, the cost of wood fiber installation, which we love to specify where we can. And I guess our hope is the more we work with it, and the more that other people specify these better materials in construction, the demand will push up further
So is
supply.
wood fiber insulation now manufactured in the UK?
No, that isn't. No. So only the hempcrete.
Import it from.
You have to import it. And there isn't anyone that makes wood fiber insulation in the UK. And I would love to get involved in somehow promoting someone to set that factory up. But at the moment, I can't really imagine what timber stocks they'd be using because we don't have enough forestry cover, I think, in the UK to supply a wood fiber industry. There's a kind of a few things. It's like we should plant some more trees, we should have better forestry practices and support
That's
more
a huge
sawmills.
topic. That's
yeah, exactly.
a really
it's like a whole other
I'm working on a book, as you know, a forthcoming book on materials, and we've just had a draft of the timber chapter in, and I was shocked how much timber goes into fuel. You know, and
we burn most of it.
We
burn most of our timber in the UK.
Yeah, I just was shocked by that. Well, yeah. So do you think things are changing? I mean, do you see an increased demand and uptake across the industry for these kinds of materials that you're advocating? Or
yeah, absolutely. I think we definitely do. It's sort of happening, I think, incrementally. But we did some work mapping material supplies in the kind of northeastern Yorkshire a couple of years ago, and we found there, like, there's a new insulation manufacturer setting up in Scotland called Indie Nature, and they make a hemp bat insulation. They have enough demand to exist, and they didn't exist before, so I think there are lots of things to be celebrating. They're just all very small scale, and there aren't kind of the policy mechanisms behind these changes, I think, to make them happen quickly enough and for demand to rise fast enough.
It's really interesting. One of the people I interviewed on my AJ Climate Champions podcast, I don't know if you've listened to this one, or I've come across her. Her name is Dominique Gauzin-Muller. She's an amazing woman. She's based in Stuttgart, but she's French, and she's done a lot of work in Eastern France, Strasbourg and Nancy and around there. And they've actually mapped across, I think it's not Alsace, I think it's Lorraine. They've mapped all the sawmills, all the sources of local regenerative materials, so that someone who wants to specify that has this kind of like I guess what used to be a directory. It's an online directory where you can see who's got what immediately, and if it's near you. And it just seems that every project can't do this research over and over again. So we need to develop these kinds of resources. And
absolutely.
I just thought that was very, very interesting.
It sounds amazing.
I'll send you a link about that. So let me see what questions we've got in the chat. Meanwhile, tell us a little bit about your book. I haven't actually seen it yet, sadly. So give us a quick rundown of what it is.
Yeah, I'm like asking around. Here's one. There you go. It's very small.
Right. So what is it?
It's called Material Reform. With my colleagues George Massoud and Paloma Gormley, and an excellent editor and writer called Amma Kadal, we co-authored the book, and it is a series of essays, kind of chapters that have they're kind of distinct from each other. So we talk about timber and technification, extraction, clay, and soil, and carbon, and we try and guess the premise of the book is that each of these different themes that we think about and talk about in the practice are equally weighted across the book. So they're all given the same kind of precedence. So, soil and land use are on the same footing as something like demolition and timber. And there's a photo essay.
How can people get hold of it if they're interested in?
You can buy it online from Mac Books, I think.
From where?
Probably Mac Books, who are the publisher.
Books,
MACK, they're wonderful.
Is there a link on your website, Material Culture's website?
There is a link on our website coming up, and there's one on our Instagram as well.
Okay, perfect. So there are a couple of questions for you, Summer, that have come up here. Could you explain in a bit more detail the final buildup of the external wall assembly component by component? It was a little quick the first time around.
I saw that one. I mean, it's just, I'll try and do it quickly because it might take a while. Simply, it's a hemp. From inside to outside, we have hempcrete, fluffy wood fiber in between the studs, a sheathing board. I saw somebody asked about air tightness, so we have a sheathing board on the outside of the timber studs, which does our air tightness and also racking structurally, and that is called panel vent, and it's an an MDF which doesn't have formaldehyde in it. And on the outside of that, we have rigid wood fiber, so water permeable and also quite solid wood fiber insulation. And then the cladding is fixed directly to that insulation. So that's kind of,
And there's
that's
a
everything,
follow-up
yeah.
question. Where is the airtightness line?
That is the panel vent. And also the rigid wood fiber insulation is keys into itself. So it's got tongue and grooving. So those joints are taped, and we have two lines of airtightness defense.
Okay, so now one for Darren. I was thinking this one, I knew someone would ask it. What was it that you're thinking behind using concrete on the floor of a historic building rather than a more sustainable, albeit more expensive, breathable limecrete solution?
Yeah, so we did look at alternatives. I mean, you know, the first real sort of consideration was to put back another timber floor. But actually, our QS, really early days, was quite concerned about not just the cost of installing that, but what the ongoing maintenance cost was, because it's a really highly trafficked space. And the client was also really concerned about, you know, how often were they going to have to sand that floor down, reapply some form of surface over the top. And actually, when we got so we went out and got quotes for, you know, 2 or 3 different alternatives. And actually, you know, a timber floor over insulation with a screed was actually more expensive than putting in a, you know, 100 mil polished concrete floor. And therefore that floor that's in there now is in there for, you know, however long, you know, hopefully another 50 or 100 years. And that was something that Fran, who's the vicar, talked a lot about, was that it wasn't just about what we were doing now, it was about we had to make sure that what we were doing now was going to be there in another 100 years. And what they didn't want to do was this continual, you know, maintenance issue. And I knew the question was going to come up, because shock horror, you use concrete, but actually it's really important to have that trade-off, you know. So the conversations were around, you know, if you're using air source heat pump and you've got your renewable energy, there's no point putting down a material that is then going to need continual maintenance.
It's great to have a client who's able to consider the long term in that way. It's not always the case.
It's not, but then you know, there were some really interesting sort of happy accidents. Once that floor went down, we realized that the other thing that floor was giving us was a lot more light reflection in the building, and we didn't choose it for that purpose. Whereas the parquet flooring was lovely, it was aged, it was antique, and I noticed one of the questions came in and said, well, you know, what did you do with it? Well, we took it up and sold it for quite a sum of money, and somebody came and collected it, and that went back in the budget. So we didn't just take it up and ditch it. And all our projects were doing similar things. You know, we're passionate about kind of reuse and reimagining on sort of 95% of our projects.
That's so great. So there's another question here about the church from Roger Ashman. Was the church keen to maintain a traditional prayer, praise, worship space?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, although Fran is not traditional in the complete traditional sense of the way that he runs his Sunday services, it was really important that on a Sunday there was still going to be a space. So you might have seen in some of the early sketches and drawings we did, we looked at different layouts and configurations of the space. And so the other reason for putting the concrete floor in and the underfloor heating, it means that they can lay that space out however they want to on a Sunday morning and a Sunday afternoon. And although they don't deliver their services from the kind of high altar, they're 3 steps down on the floor in the vision with everybody else. And the other thing that I've observed is that going to other churches where you sit on a Sunday to observe what happens, they just let their young people just do what they want. So it's not a case, some churches you go to, they come and remove the young people 20 minutes into the service and they take them off to separate rooms. Here, you just get these amazing young people who just do circuits on a Sunday, and Fran gives his service, and you just let anything happen. So it's kind of quite holistic in that way.
That's great. There's another question here about the church. Did you end up with any damp issues as water is pushed towards the solid walls if the floor isn't breathable? Is it vented?
It's very vented because we've got windows that are no longer windows; they're just bits of OSB board. So I don't believe that we've had any issues with damp. The only issue that we've got at the moment is the fact we've got water ingress coming through areas of the roof, which we're going to have to replace.
Summer, question for you from Ian Liptrot. Would sheep's wool insulation have been an alternative option? And did you look at that, and why was it ruled out?
Yeah, no, it absolutely would have been good as well. There's a lot
What
of
are
great.
the pros and cons of one versus the other? Or why did you choose the wood fiber?
I guess we were interested in it kind of being fully plant-based, and kind of just because of where the building was and the narrative around its kind of tree friends living around it. And to some extent, I guess, when you're pairing, we were pairing fluffy and rigid insulation together, and there isn't the same dense bath with sheep's wool as there is with wood fiber. So we were able to get from one supplier both types of insulation, kind of very simply. But yeah, sheep's wool is also great.
Another question for you from Callum Bolger. How long did it take for the contractor to become comfortable working with the materials like the hemp blocks and the wood fiber insulation? To be honest with you, they didn't become comfortable with the hempcrete. We got the price of the stonework installation down by finding somebody we knew who worked with lime and subcontracting that package out ourselves. But once we'd installed it, they thought it was very nice. And how much supervision did you have to do?
Quite a lot.
On site?
Quite regularly, yeah. I mean, we love going on site. Really exciting and fun.
Like every week, or
every week,
more than once a week.
No, once a week, probably not in some periods when it was quiet, and it was towards the it was a kind of staggered over the pandemic, so there was lots of periods of complete inactivity as well. But yeah, no, we like to go, and also that getting to know a contractor, you only learn the way that they work and the way they make their own independent decisions quite regularly on site, so you only catch them and get a sense of how they do that by going and talking to them.
So here's another question for you from an anonymous person attendee. How do you consider longevity of materials in your schemes? I'm sure you get that one a lot. Yeah,
we get that one a lot, I think. And there's no reason they couldn't last decades and decades and centuries if they're maintained. And I think that's true of all buildings, really, to be honest. So I feel very good about it.
That's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to ask you each. There's one question here. Let's see. Well, there's someone who asked if you, Darren, you could run through all the different user groups that are now active in the church one more time.
Yeah, so if I start with the main spaces, we've got the cafe, we've got the shop, we've got the bike recycling, we've got the food bank, and we've got the children's play centre. So those are the kind of sort of fixed, sort of temporary elements. And then throughout the week, they have various choirs that will rent the space and take part. They'll have various toddlers groups. There'll then be things that the church will then put on. So they may well be counselling. They may well be putting on debt consultation. Who else? Let me think. Yoga happens in that space. Interestingly, because Portsmouth's a naval port, both this church and one of the other churches we're working on quite often have some of the Royal Navy coming to use the spaces. I mean, to be honest, there aren't any kind of restrictions on who can sort of rent that space out, and it's a growing congregation, so the other interesting thing is they used to do a Sunday service. They now do an early morning service for slightly younger groups. They have a youth group that also meets once or twice a week within the space.
A lot of activity going on. Got a couple of more questions, and we've just got about 10 minutes left. So this is for Summer. The overall price of Blockhouse, if it were built out of conventional materials, do you have a sense of how it would compare, what sort of an uplift there is for this approach?
I suppose that's a sort of how long with a piece of string kind of question, I think, because it depends which conventional materials in which bits. And timber framing is actually pretty conventional. in lots of ways. And in Scotland, that's how volume house builders make houses. It's just in the UK that we have, well, in England, where there's some higher prevalence of brick slip and block production. But the one time we did some research about comparing a volume house built house, so not the kind of building like block houses, built at scale, we had information that was about 30% uplift, I think.
30.
But
So
I mean, that's probably,
yeah,
there are ways to go to bring that down. And I think that information is probably quite out of date now. So yeah, don't hold us to
that
it.
sounds high.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to come back to Darren. We touched on this when we chatted, I guess it was last week. Could you comment on, obviously we're keen for people to submit projects to our AJ Small Projects. And do you have any comment on how winning this award has impacted your practice or the project? Has there been any ripple effect back to you that you've heard about?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, at the time that we won it, we were totally and utterly shocked. I mean, for us, getting shortlisted, we already thought we'd won, because I think you had 150 entries last year, and then there were 20 shortlisted. So as far as we were concerned, just being there on the evening, we'd won. In fact, I shouldn't really tell you this, Hattie, but I think I had to be persuaded to leave the pub after we'd done the presentation by a couple of my ex-students who said, "What do you mean you're not going to the evening thing?" And I said, "Well, we're not going to win anything." And they said, "Darren, you have to go." But almost immediately the day after, we were contacted by the diocese because we were talking about several other things, and they, immediately they heard about this, and suddenly we went from maybe we might do this to yes, here's 3 new projects. Oh, and actually here's the opportunity to talk about other ones. And I think for us as well, it's really kind of crystallized the sort of first 4 years of the practice as to why we set the practice up. And so I think it's kind of, it's really sort of brought home to us that it's important to kind of, concentrate on what your beliefs are. And I think, when I look at the work that Summer's doing and her practice, again, it's really strong. And I think, it's really important to have a really key philosophy about what you're working around, whether you're teaching or you're practicing. The two things are interchangeable. So in a way, it felt like we were going back to school when we came to present on the whatever it was, the Wednesday or the Thursday. So
and you only had 3 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
2
think we
minutes,
used 10.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's really, really interesting to hear. We've had numerous launch events for AJ Small Projects over the year where, I think the likes of Alison Brooks and, other architects who are now, kind of very much at the top of their game started with an AJ Small Projects win. So it's really interesting to hear your comments on this. Okay, this is the last question for each of you. Are there any things you would do differently if you were to consider this project again? Who wants to take it first?
Shall I jump in?
Okay, go ahead, Darren.
I think there was a few things that we were looking at as component parts that we probably wouldn't have spent our time on, and we were designing some sort of movable bits of furniture that we were going to put shops and things into. And I think, had we known how far the budget was not going to stretch, we probably wouldn't have spent time on looking at those things. But those are things that you learn once you're working on these types of projects with tight budgets.
Summer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in lots of ways, it felt like it was a real kind of privilege to have been selected, and also to see all the other work, which is kind of amazing. Incredible selection of projects. It was really exciting shortlist, it felt. And I guess since then it's felt like we've had lots of interest in the work that we do, and lots of contact from different people. So we felt very lucky to be in such good company in the shortlist.
And what about the last question, if there's anything you would do differently in hindsight on Blockhouse?
Sorry, in the last question, lots of things. Sorry, I would do lots of things differently. I think the primary thing I would have spent a bit more time doing is trying to work actually in and around the landscaping of the project. But I think
that always comes last. You know, I
always
bang on
comes
about
last,
that a
yeah.
lot. I mean, you're in such a beautiful natural setting that you can kind of get away with it, but
Mm.
architects need to put that up front.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Well, I think we're done. Let me see if there's anything else that's come into the chat. Someone's going to order your book already, Summer. And let me just see if there's anything else here
Thank you.
that we've got a couple of minutes. I think we've covered most of these. I think I've managed to get them all this time. Amazing. There's someone here recommending a project to look at. Shirley Waldron is saying, look out Natural Fit Gym in Hove. I think we're good. Unless you have any concluding points final point you'd like to make. I would just like to thank everyone for coming. It's great to see such interest in this. This is the first time we've run a sustainability webinar on small projects, and it's just really, really great to see this amount of interest. And I think it's a tribute to the two of you and the great work that you're doing. So thank you for taking time to join us today. And
Thank you so much.
See you in person one day soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye.